My talk actually today is going to try to respond to or follow two agendas or two threads. So first, I would like to reflect on a series of broader disciplinary conversations over the last 10 years that have emerged from a virtual issue in one of the flagship journals of the Society for Psychological Anthropology in the US. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Titled Sea of Anchors Towards Global Psychological Anthropologies, that I'm going to co-edit with my dear colleague Susanna Jovicic from the University of Vienna and Annika Kajunus, University of Helsinki. So that virtual issue is an attempt to take stock, and I think you do probably similar things in the new medical humanities, to see like what's the field like and what do we need and what do we want to be and what could we be. So not so much looking back, but also thinking about, okay, where do we want to go, right? Because these disciplines, these networks, these institutions, these departments are not owned by anyone, right? So although sometimes it might appear as there is some particular kind of big players and then they own whole departments or they own whole schools, and that is something that we try not to do, that we are a network and we try to actually say, okay, this network, psychological anthropology, is for everyone, right? Good. But that, of course, is lip service only. So we try to take stock of what psychological anthropology can be, where it is headed, and what kinds of institutional, epistemic, and geopolitical forces and challenges shape its trajectories. So second, I will ground these reflections in two empirical cases or examples from our collaborative research on children's perceptions of nature, their affective, sensory, and imaginative relationships with their environments and animals in different cultural and ecological settings. And second, also, that might be more interesting to some of you here, maybe, I don't know, a shorter example from our long-term and long-running work on clinical encounters and mental health or global mental health in Indonesia. So my aim is to bring these two strands together in the next 28.5 minutes and to show how decentering, so that's the key word for me today, how decentering conceptually, methodologically, and infrastructurally, which is often forgotten, is not just an abstract disciplinary aspiration or imagination or desire. So it is something that plays out in the everyday lives, in the imaginations, in social, cultural, and the ecological relations of communities and persons that we work with. So why not think through it also as academics or as researchers? So this talk, therefore, is both an invitation, because I'd like to invite you back, so to speak, symbolically speaking, and a proposition. An invitation to think with me about the futures of psychological anthropology and new medical humanities, and a proposition to consider how our field might orient itself, not around a single center, but around what we called a sea of anchors, a distributed ecology of knowledge, methods, and collaborations. So let me begin with the disciplinary landscape. So if we ask, and maybe you also want to ask yourselves that question, well, I do sometimes, where is psychological anthropology fill in the blanks today, right? Especially considering that it's an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinarily oriented research endeavor, which, to be bluntly honest, within my own discipline, anthropology is becoming less and less. It feels like we're creating more and more silos. We're writing in more and more jargon that only a particular group of scholars understands and then also applauds, right? It's a very jargony thing, some of the anthropologies. And some of the psychological anthropologies that we work with, or that I would like to also, that I invite, is something that where the language is not necessarily convoluted, but accessible also, globally speaking. So, yes, so let me begin. So the answer is not straightforward. And this is, I've seen some psychological anthropologists in the room, so I hope you agree. And if you disagree, please join the Q&A. In some ways, psychological anthropology feels like it is everywhere And that's, of course, not biased and not a subjective perspective. Of course it is, it's my perspective. It feels like it's everywhere. It's deeply embedded in phenomenological approaches, person-centered ethnography, affect theory, sensory anthropology, mental health research, cultural psychology, and more recently also ecological and multi-species studies. At the same time, it also feels fragmented. So we work across institutions that rarely acknowledge one another, across methods that sometimes barely speak to one another, and across regions that are unequally resourced. So we see that we have, for example, this is just an example. So what we can observe from this European network of psychological anthropology, for example, is there's a rise of affect and emotion studies in particularly the Europes, and there are cultural schemas and cultural psychologies very, very heavy in the US. Decolonial and indigenous psychologies and chairs and whole departments are popping up in Indonesia, for example. There is the Indonesian government is about to launch. It's really like a launch. It's like a rocket launch from zero to hero. Is 18 departments of indigenous psychology at the biggest Indonesian universities. That is, I think that's unique, probably. I hope it's not. Maybe there's others who follow, but who are really actively trying to bring together different methodologies, different epistemologies, different concepts of the mind and well-being and so forth, and also teach it. So not only to use so-called decolonial or non-Eurocentric ontologies as examples or outliers, but really understand them as theory, as method, and also as acknowledged knowledge. So also there's a growing multilingual and multimodal and interspecies approaches coming, particularly our colleagues in Latin America are spearheading this, like for Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia. The colleagues there are engaging a lot in interspecies collaborations through indigenous psychological perspective. So some of these currents overlap beautifully and others remain siloed. And they are unevenly funded, unevenly cited. That's what we call decolonizing the syllabus at my department. We try to decolonize the syllabus in order to not only bring the heavyweights in that you can find in a 3-second ChatGPT or Google search, but to try to also integrate scholars who are not necessarily writing in English. And if they write in English, maybe they're not necessarily publishing in the high impact journals, and try to decolonize the syllabus. So that's one way for me as a scholar who works at a German university to contribute to kind of a more globally oriented scholarship. Good. And it's, of course, also unevenly visible. So the fragmentation is not unique to psychological anthropology, and still our field bears it in particular ways because, and it might also resonate with Hughes, because we sit at the intersection of anthropology, psychology, psychiatry, educational studies, neuroscience. Sometimes there's a branch called neuroanthropology, and increasingly environmental humanities. So at this intersection, questions of power, authority, and epistemic legitimacy become especially acute. It's not only which disciplines are hegemonic in an interdisciplinary encounter, but also which regions of knowledge, which ecologies of knowledge, meaning which writers that are not necessarily trained in the dominant canons can become role models for us to think trans and interdisciplinary collaboration in new and not yet existing ways. So there's a lot of learning from what previously has been called the margins, right? But I'm also going to come to the margins in a second. So am I still on track? Yeah. So, for example, I mean, the mind, right? That's something, the mind or the brain or both or who or what, and how do they relate? And I mean, wow, these are huge questions that are particularly the Husserl archive and New Medical Humanities I've read that you're also mulling over a lot and doing great work. And for me, it's always the question, like, right, when we work in transcultural spaces, and the transcultural spaces are not necessarily in Java or in Timor-Leste, where we also work, but they're just here, right? They're just, we live in a highly mobile, fluid, kind of intersectional world where actually we might want to do a little bit more thorough thinking and doing, I would say, and including myself, on whose concept of mind actually travels globally. These are questions that you're doing, I think, all the time. But also whose developmental models shape best practices in childhood socialization, education, and therapy interventions. Because these are not innocent vehicles, right? Like certain, and I don't want to name the institutions or the global international NGOs and so forth, which are fed through particular publications. Surprise, surprise, always the same authors, and why not other authors coming from the same high impact labs and journals. I'm also not going to name the journals, but they're these kind of with a Hirsch impact factor of 120 or something like that. I don't know how that is. So a bit suspicious. So whose notions of well-being, of emotional personhood become standardized, become models, for example, in the global mental health movement, and whose ecological knowledge is dismissed as anecdotal, unscientific, or ontological and cultural, rather than recognized as real expertise and a contribution, a theoretical contribution to the field, and not just ethnographic material. These questions have kind of shaped this virtual issue and also some of our discussions, hopefully after the input. So faced with this uneven landscape, Susanna, Annie, and I sought an alternative conceptual language for thinking about decentering. And it's language first, and then we would like to formulate a couple of suggestions, and maybe we can discuss them afterwards. Is this utopia? Is this dystopia? What are you talking about? We've heard this before, another clever, talk, but not much action. So these would be the conversations after, probably. So we found the metaphors of center and periphery. Got it, I hope. Yeah, great. Yeah, so the center and periphery inadequate. They reproduce the very hierarchies we aim to critique. Because when we think about the center, we all have probably particular centers of like powerhouses of, I don't know, impactful scholarship or methodology in our head. So that's not where we wanted to go. They imply a fixed geography of knowledge, usually also dispersed around the world, particularly in psychology or psychiatry. It is the high impact labs around the world, kind of these 25 labs that create 60% of the samples and also of the publications in those journals. And they suggest that everything must either move toward the center or maintain margin. So, but the empirical reality of psychological anthropology today is far more fluid. So we propose the metaphors of anchors, right? So anchors. What is an anchor? And anchor, because my English sometimes is, I have problems with it's too many O's and R's in a row. So an anchor is a temporary dynamic point of orientation, a moment or a place where ideas, resources, and collaborations condense. So anchors could be a research network, a workshop, a methodological toolkit, a lecture series, a cross-regional, cross-translocal collaboration, a subfield, or a group of scholars who, through collaboration, generate a gravitational pull towards their kind of thinkings. And that is very different when we talk about the centers that are established institutionally and not necessarily through emerging from collaborations. And they emerge and they can vanish again, right? It's a more dynamic concept for us of collaboration than the center periphery. So anchors are not fixed permanent structures, they shift. They are mobile, they can appear and disappear as conditions change. So an anchor helps with, and this is a metaphor, an anchor for our transdisciplinary collaboration, helps with navigation, provides stability in a moving environment, prevents drift, but not by forcing centralization. So crucially, anchors can be multiplied. A single center is hierarchical, but a sea of anchors allows for multiple points of orientation, plural entry points into the field, recognition of diverse epistemologies, and this I think is important, flexible, low threshold collaboration, and distributed forms of authority. In such a sea, and I love the sentence, but it's very cheesy. In such a sea, you no longer need a flagship vessel. You can travel by canoe, kayak, bamboo raft, or whatever vessel your conditions afford. It is important to emphasize decentering is not simply what I'm doing here, a rhetorical gesture. It is not enough to declare that we want to decolonize psychology or decolonize anthropology or provincialize Europe, in Deepesh Chakraborty's words. These statements ring hollow if they are not accompanied by changes in, and this is what we were thinking about, and maybe I'm sure there's more or less, or the collaboration practices, citation politics, accessibility and logistics, authorship, research funding distribution. This is not new, right? Teaching and mentorship, conference formats, like always. I mean, honestly, right? I don't know how you feel about it, but conferences, you know, like 6 sessions a day, 106 times 90 minutes, kind of sitting and trying to find clever questions in order to either tease the person standing there or to challenge or to contribute or to applaud. So I think there's also other formats of actually sharing and engaging with other in knowledge, including labs. There's this lab format that we're now experimenting with. Also, time zones are an issue for some of us. Visa issues, translation infrastructures, and importantly, the practical realities of early career scholars, which is very often forgotten. So what does that mean? So what I mean, like examples would be, so who gets to attend global conferences, right? There's a lot of gatekeeping in those conferences that you're even allowed to enter the space. It's the registration fees. You need to have a credit card, which really is not a thing that every country has. Our Argentinian colleagues, for example, have written about this, Mariana Palacios and Paula Chabel. They have written about their experiences when they wanted to attend one of our conferences, but they couldn't because the credit card system didn't work. Some banks don't acknowledge some other banks. So there's so much infrastructural issues and so forth. Also, who has childcare support, funding, or institutional backing? Who can publish in English language journals without paying exorbitant fees sometimes? Who has the right to move freely across borders? And whose ethical frameworks are actually recognized as legitimate? So when we think about internal review boards or ethics commissions, which ethics do we actually promote here? So what is the whole ethics program about? Is it about securing the university legally that they cannot be sued in case one of our respondents sues the university, or is the university actively taking responsibility, ethical responsibility and care of its scholars? How do we treat our respondents? So I think when we talk about ethics, I mean, don't get us started, but I think it's really when we think about how the university and the departments and the institute treats their researchers, that's unethical. If we just applied the standards, how we are not supposed to deal with our respondents and informants, interlocutors. So, but nobody really takes care of that, right? Because our camera goes rightfully so towards our interlocutors, interviewees, and so forth, and towards the legal bodies. Okay, that's a whole other book. So these very mundane, bureaucratic, logistical details shape the borders of our discipline far more than abstract theory does. So those research infrastructures, they're always forgotten. I have colleagues who would sometimes say, you know, Indonesian anthropology is not really that as advanced as German anthropology. Bollocks. It's super advanced and it's super productive, but it's just moving in different spaces. And other spaces are just for getting a visa, for example, are just not open. to some people who hold specific passports. And then some of us might think, there's not much happening over there. There's not much happening here. Of course not. If you don't have, if the infrastructure is not made for you, and we don't do anything to embrace also colored bodies and minds into those spaces. Okay, good. Also another whole book. So decentering, therefore, means creating infrastructures that enable participation, not only proclaiming pluralism. So, and this is where, for example, my work, and I will keep this brief, no, our work, slip of the tongue, environmental perceptions offer a powerful analogy. So children anchor themselves in their environments through sensory, relational, and imaginative practices that are deeply local, yet never isolated from larger ecologies. And the same, I believe, and we believe, holds true for our intellectual practices. So at this point, let me very briefly shift to just our collaboration in the context of, we call it Children and Nature. So it is about, I'm not going to go into methods and case study, don't worry, because I think this is a different register here. But I would like to use it as an example of how psychological anthropology can enact decentering through method, theory, and collaboration, and where the main challenges lie that we could not overcome. So here you see my colleague Katja, and at this point, let me shift the disciplinary to the, so the study I will discuss today emerges from a long-standing collaborative work over like our own research team, what's now 2025, around 20 years, a more or less systematic, I mean, it's not a funded project in that way, it's just basically for 20 years we work with students and with colleagues in Indonesia to think about, okay, what are their perceptions about nature and about animals? Because that is also something that became particularly prominent here, the narrative that, our kids have never touched the soil, or, my boy has never seen a cow, or my boy has never stepped into cow shit or dog shit. Yeah, dog shit, yes. The cities are full of it. But right, you get it. So this whole biophilia hypothesis where we need to bring our kids more into nature, whatever it is, in order to also sustain and care for their cognitive and emotional development, right? So that's the claim. And good. So that's what we were thinking about. And this is a collaboration now since 2020 with the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. And on a larger global interdisciplinary scale, I'm not going to go into detail. I'm going to show a paper a bit later on. If you're interested, you can download it. But that's not what this talk is about. So the project that has grown, so we have done this work with small teams, with collaborators in Indonesia who are now also working as postdocs or professors at Indonesian universities. And there we have done a couple of studies, and I will talk about this only very briefly. But then in 2020, COVID came, and I don't know how it was here, but there were whole research departments that actually have lost, like our so-called research collaborators, right? Our research partners, our research assistants that many of us work with were suddenly jobless, like fully jobless, because we as anthropologists usually do the stuff on our own or with very flexible relationships that are on and off, where we might get a Werkvertrag for someone or something, but it's not. But other disciplines, like particularly the cross-cultural psychologists, they work with whole teams. So all of these friends and colleagues have, during COVID for 2 years, lost their jobs. Right. So then we tried to think about, okay, what can we do? And then we came up with something that we, in hindsight, called collaborative remote ethnography. So, and there we tried to, over 2 years, try to pay and employ research partners in 20 countries. And then we have this huge kind of online video archive now that we try to use in publishing together. Right. So we've written a very self-critical and self-reflexive, almost self-demoting piece that I'm going to show later, where we actually acknowledge all of our mistakes. The journal was highly confused because they said, why are you not selling your idea? And said, we can't, we make so many mistakes. And it took us almost 4 years to get that paper published because they didn't want to have, what are your results? And we said, we're not interested in talking about our results. We want to talk about the challenges in what we wanted to do, namely decolonial collaborative ethnography. And we failed in at least 27 points. But the decolonial collaboration, some might say, is also about failure if we do that respectfully and ethically, whatever that means. So good. So assumptions, for example, were deconstructed, like, which we hear a lot in ecological psychology. Is anyone from ecological psychology here? No, okay, then I can continue. Is a wonderful discipline, also young one, I think, in Germany. So you would have a lot of fears like that the forest is peaceful, right? Forests are peaceful. Nature is something out there separate from humans. The play in green spaces promotes well-being and health. Children learn about ecology through curricula that are designed elsewhere, and that's okay. So, but ethnographically, these assumptions have fallen apart quickly. So the guiding questions for us were, what counts as nature for children in different contexts? And how do local ecologies shape children's emotional relations to the more than human, to the non-human? What role do cultural narratives, family practices, and material environments play in their perspectives of what nature is or might be? And how do children's drawings, stories, and play express ecological knowledge? And how can such knowledge challenge universalist assumptions built into environmental psychology, and particularly also child development research? So the comparative design included children in urban and rural and peri-urban. Also that category, I think, is not necessarily helpful, because what is rural now with gadgets and so forth, but you might want to include the architecture. You might want to include a couple of things that actually transcend the notion of rural and urban. We had a huge problem to operationalize that category, right? So is the Münsterland, is that rural? Is that urban? Right? Or what about the Münster Speckgürtel, Gievenbeck? Is that rural or is it urban? So, and these concepts don't really fly when you translate them to different contexts today. So what we did then, particularly in the Indonesian work, in the work in Indonesia with our collaborators, and I'm happy to also cite their names after if you're interested. We used drawing sessions, we used walking conversations, and we had a lot of play-based methods. So because we realized pretty quickly that, surprise, surprise, kids are not interested in talking to adults that much and explaining what nature is. That some interviews, it was great with our psychology students from Indonesia. Some interviews just took 8 seconds and then they left. So we had to adapt, we had to bring in more child-centered methodologies, and I love that. I love working with psychologists who are creative, or with artists, or with designers, to come up with a methodology in the context of childhood studies that just does justice to the subjectivity and to actually be, the interest of the children. Okay, good. So let me share some key findings, but through the lens of the anchors, back to the anchors, right? So because this is where I think theory and method could meet. So, and this is very brief, because this is not a childhood studies center. And I'm also not necessarily in childhood studies any longer. So, but the key findings over the last 20 years were that, for example, in some communities, and please bear with me, you might know this, but I have to find a way to bring it back to the anchors. In some communities, nature was not a place of peace or well-being, right? It's not that you have to spend time in the green in order to be well. It was associated with spirits and ghosts, with snakes. This is all from the kids, from the children's narratives. With hunger, with unpredictable weather, with economic precarity, thinking about nature and about, horticulture and farming in the context of climate change and droughts and floods. memories of flooding, landslides, or cyclone damage. So in these settings, nature was not something to reconnect with, as many theories say. But of course, I'm not trying to do injustice by willfully misreading them, but these concepts they develop an epistemic power. And they develop an epistemic power also in terms of reproducing certain funding schemes and reproducing certain research collaborations that ask certain questions. So, of course, these researchers know that these are probably know that they are Eurocentric categories, but still that doesn't suffice if we're not trying to also bring in kind of, for example, indigenous developmental psychologies. So one child also drew a forest as a set of eyes watching her. Another described the sea as, in English, as sometimes monster, sometimes mother. So that was close to the sea, to the shore. And they had seen the news on tsunamis in certain areas. So these perceptions are not deficits or outliers. They are ecologies of knowledge shaped by lived experience. So the second point is that in other communities, and particularly this is interesting for those who have ever heard of permaculture, Timor-Leste has, since this year, the first nationwide educational curriculum for primary and secondary school from 1st to 9th grade, which teaches through permaculture theory and permaculture practice. So the kids in the grammar schools and the primary schools are learning biology and history and so forth in school gardens through the principles of permaculture, meaning sustainable cultural practices and sustainable environmental and also agricultural practices. This is stunning. Timor-Leste has a population of around 2 million people, not too many, but still imagine what that actually means if a local epistemology, because permaculture traveled from Australia to East Timor, but actually what permaculture in Timor-Leste means is that it is basically local epistemologies of tending to the soil and working and bringing the water back and trying to read history from kind of their perspectives and not the colonizers' perspective. So, and that is a national curriculum which kind of throws out Portuguese curricula, which was the colony for the colonizing power for 450 years, or the Indonesian occupiers. So wonderful, but let's not go there. So they expressed a lot of care. I'm not going to go into detail here. A lot of care, composting, watering, planting. So really, you could see after there was the pilot started in 2015, you could see how different narratives about the nature and how to deal with it really can have an impact. So there is a shift in perspective of dealing with and attending to the soil. And okay, I'm getting carried away because this is the project that I work on now for 8 years, and it's the closest to the heart actually. So good, let's skip this a bit, speed it up. Good. Also, imagination and wonder, of course, is so it was just the creativity, right? And I'm not trying to exoticize children here, but that different trees have personalities, or that clouds have moods, or everything that I used to probably also think when I was a kid. They just, who's they? But I forgot about it, and this is the beauty of working with kids. So animals expressed more lessons to them, when, for example, when a certain animal passes, from left to right and right to left, then it tells you something, and it's dead serious about it, right? So dead serious about kind of that theory of, let's say, the squirrel. So where it goes, left, right, or right, left. I forgot the Indonesian word. Yeah. So this imaginative ecology is often overlooked in developmental psychologies, in anthropologies also, or childhood studies, which tends to prioritize cognition and quantitative methods based on validated and more often than not, Eurocentric questionnaires over affect or imagination mined through child-centered ethnographic methods. Yet imagination is one of the anchors through which children orient themselves in ecological systems. Another point, and then I wrap this up, another point is that there's a lot about, so in the urbanizing environments of Indonesia, I think Jakarta has now been voted the largest city in the world, and it is, I mean, I also have family there. So that is really something where talking about nature is about absence more than about presence. So it's about, for example, rivers don't flow any longer, or they're basically just non-managed waste dumps. Forest patches are replaced by housing. Plastic waste is where gardens once were. Now that we have these mega cities, and yeah, I mean, I think in 2030 or 2035, the prediction is that I don't know, 70% of the world population are going to live in mega cities or something like that. Whoever made those statistics. So that's concerning. That heat that makes outdoor play impossible. You know, you cannot play outside because it's too hot or too polluted, and so forth. So a lot of kids also expressed sadness and confusion or longing for landscapes that they had been told about but never seen. So what do these findings tell us? I think they tell us a great deal about how to practice decentering in psychological anthropology, and children do not orient themselves around a single center of nature. Their ecological knowledge is multiplex. Their anchors are many. And this mirrors precisely the kind of disciplinary ecology we argue for, one where psychological anthropology does not revolve around a single epistemic center, but instead fosters multiple points of orientation, multiple forms of expertise, multiple ways of knowing, and multiple situated pedagogies. The work with children has shown us that plurality is not a problem, but I think I'm preaching to the wrong choir here. It is the condition for meaningful orientation. So now briefly about the research in Indonesia on mental health. Is anyone in psychiatry here? Transcultural psychiatry or working on and with psychiatry?
Only David is here, psychiatry.
Yeah.
It probably comes a bit later.
Yeah, okay.
And we have more theoretical knowledge of psychiatry, but we are not practicing, and we're not trained psychiatrists.
So basically so what we in psychological anthropology also do is a lot about working kind of on epistemologies, on theories, and trying to open kind of different spaces. Is that's what I read on?
I mean, David is just a medical doctor, and he did this research in psychiatry. Yeah, I think I'm breaking with the ontologies that from phenomenology. Okay, you heard
I did.
my
Yes.
presentation.
Yes. Okay, because if you're also not, and if you're doing this anyway in your own works, I think I want to skip this very briefly. So because it is, I mean, it's very short. So it's basically this here, so this is something that also started working with youth living in homeless conditions in 2001 as a student, and then there was a lot of death and dying. There was the HIV/AIDS pandemic also that hit the streets of Jakarta, and then we established a shelter for homeless persons, particularly youth, where we also established kind of a care network, and in the case of death and dying, we organized certificates. So the research was always very applied, or we called it collaborative action research. So, but now recently we have more, and this is basically Dr. Ariani, Dr. Pujo, Dr. Hendi, and Dr. Florin, who maybe is online, who are working on these projects. So I'm more kind of, I don't know what I am actually. I'm the Grüßonkel. So they're doing great work, because they, I think similar to you, what they have now started doing is talking about these emergent biomedical subjectivities in the context of global mental health, right? So that is a huge movement where the Indonesian government is also investing a lot of money to create new clinics, to also boost psychiatry and to boost medicalization, in juxtaposition and in addition to actually these factors that I wanted to briefly mention, to spiritual healing, religious counseling, local moral frameworks, family care, and so forth. So what my colleagues are doing, and particularly early in so-called mid-career researchers, their wonderful work, you can also look it up, I can send it to you if you're interested, is that they're trying to work through the concepts of schizophrenia and bipolar disorders from kind of decentered perspectives. And that is not necessarily the same as kind of folk theory or local theories or Javanese. It's in Java and Bali, and Javaneseness or Balineseness. So what they're working with is they really try to think through recovery. So not so much through the perspective of kind of symptoms and idioms and nosology, but try to look at schizophrenia and bipolar disorders in local terminologies and look at them from the recovery end. So what's the aim here? What's the goal? What are the imaginations? What is possible? And that is quite an interesting shift, at least to me, in perspective, when you think from the recovery end, because then you can, it's a lot about imaginations, it's a lot about desires, it's a lot about emotions, it's not so much about the suffering. But they could talk a little bit more about that. So I think you definitely hear, I mean, what I'm getting at is that, again, it's these kind of sea of anchors, it's different epistemologies, it's different nosologies, it's different perspectives on a particular kind of symptom or experience that is actually helping here in order to understand. So in the context of the, yeah, I'm going back on script, otherwise it gets a little bit too complex. Okay, great, 3 more minutes. I'm going to wrap up now. So I think that the link between the two examples, so the children and nature studies and the mental health that I only touched upon briefly, they challenge universalist claims, which is, I think, also somehow which is also almost a duty, I think, when we consider that many departments now, in kind of these new austerity measures, and at least German academia, when you think about which disciplines are discussed to be closed down, or where professorships are about not to be extended, or which research departments are about to disappear, I think it's really important that we engage with each other. And this is also why I was so happy that you invited me here, you know, because it was like, okay, new medical humanities. And then I dig deeper and I thought, hey, that could be, you know, that could be another anchor, that our anchor could also kind of get into conversation with, in order to kind of mull over and think about a couple of methodologies and epistemologies. So great. So good. So also, I think one of the so let me address another theme that I find central also to this psychological anthropology and probably new medical humanities, is that, which is central to decentering them, is the labor and the difficulty of working across disciplines and across epistemologies. And I think many of us they know the feeling of explaining, for example, phenomenology or ethnography to a psychologist or to a psychiatrist, or to explain psychiatry and psychology to an anthropologist is a hell of a job, right? And usually people stop listening after 3 sentences. It's like, okay, that's not for me, right? That's not for me. They're number crunchers. They're essentializers. Talk about the psychologists. They're Eurocentric, but this is so homogenizing, and sometimes from an anthropologist's perspective, so arrogant. But it also travels the other way, right? So anthropologists are storytellers, phenomenologists What's your sample? What's your N, right? I mean, are you talking about one person here? How is that even relevant? But these are exactly these anchors that are important because here we can talk about, all of these things like impact. What is impact? Is impact a high number? Is it a high sample? Or is it kind of really trying to think hard together, and try to come up with alternative paradigms? So how do you measure impact? This is a very difficult times, I think, that we live in, where everything is related to impact and numbers and money and another third-party funded project and so forth. Is really, really concerning, isn't it? So, good. Also, which I think is when you mediate between qualitative and quantitative expectations, and also, you can tell I'm in my late 40s. I can't do that. I can't read. So, and also translating central concepts like culture, development, or impact across epistemic worlds. And also, I think that some of us are carrying the burden of interdisciplinarity very often alone. So it's not always that you have the backing of an institution or of a working group or of your colleagues or of the disciplinary association. It can get pretty lonely. And I think that is why also it's important to kind of think through anchors and where is the next anchor that I can connect to, and where are other anchors that and we can create kind of a new kind of knowledge ecology. So this mediating labor, 2 more minutes. It's 2.5 more minutes. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, I really have a point here. So, okay, so this mediating labor is unevenly distributed. Psychological anthropologists tend to read psychology far more than psychologists or psychiatrists read anthropology or psychological anthropology. Yet, interdisciplinary engagement is not, and excuse my wording, sucking up to psychology or psychiatry. It can be a political act. Why, right? I mean, and you all know this here, is because universalist psychological models, especially those used in medicine, education, or development, like both personal development, but also structural political development in post-colonial societies, they often travel globally and impact communities unevenly and sometimes also harmfully, as we've seen. So by working with, rather than only on or about psychologists, neuroscientists, educators, public health scholars, and environmental scientists, in my case, we can intervene rather than merely critique from the sidelines. So by establishing this new Medical Humanities Center, I think it is possible to develop a gravitas that one of us would never have. And this, I think, needs differently positioned kind of expertises and experiences and contributions. So our Children and Nature project is a good example, I think, and this is the paper I talked about, like self-destructive, but honest. So our Children and Nature project is a good example. So because the psychologist expected children everywhere to kind of draw, and I'm also not doing justice to every psychologist who work with, to draw on peaceful nature, right? Or anthropologists have predicted local variation, but also in sometimes very wrong ways. Environmental educators that were also part of the project, they wanted policy recommendations, and the teachers, they wanted practical schools. So by creating a collaborative anchor, we produced something none of these separate fields could have generated on their own, right? We made a lot of mistakes, and it was a hell of a job for many years. But this is the promise of interdisciplinary anchor. So, to come to an end, what would it mean concretely to build a sea of anchors in the new Medical Humanities or psychological anthropology? It means committing to low threshold research infrastructures, multilingual publication spaces, co-authorship with community researchers, shared leadership between scholars in the so-called global south and the global north, the flexible conference formats, cross-regional mentorship, not only collaboration, collaborative ethics, not extractive ones, multimodal outputs accessible to children, to families and practitioners, not only academics, teaching methods that are multimodal, experiential, and in place-based teaching to use the environment in order to illustrate a phenomenon, acknowledging that universal models of mind, development, or emotion travel with colonial baggages. Last two sentences. It means recognizing that the most important anchors may be small. A school garden, a community workshop, a WhatsApp group, a village storytelling night, a permaculture training site, an indigenous-led research collective. These are the canoes and rafts that together make a field seaworthy. Okay, so am I at the end already? I think. Good. So a scholarly and politically relevant psychological anthropology will not emerge from a single center or a single theory, but or from methodological or disciplinary purity, which is increasingly, I hear again and again in my disciplines, like this is not anthropological enough. This is not anthropology. I mean, who says that, right? I mean, I think it's really, isn't it a little bit more interesting to think about what we could do instead of what we have done, and why this is actually not, in the purest sense, the thing that we should teach our students. So let me close with a few examples as invitations of Sea of Anchors. And this is this European Network for Psychological Anthropology that I invite everyone. And again, it's not owned by anyone, right? There is always conveners. It's a network of between 200 and 300 previously isolated early career, mid-career, and a couple of senior scholars. And the convenership rotates every 2 years. There's a new person coming in and rotating out. There is positions that are made. You know, there is work in progress seminars. You can put your profile up on that website so you become more visible as a group, and so forth and so forth. So then we had this conference in Münster. So we of course also tried to place it also within a very marginal space, like German anthropology is, compared to larger disciplines, a very marginal space. But we try to create new sets of anchors also. And this is the beauty, because you don't have to claim a center suddenly, but you can just pop an anchor and see who comes, right? And who floats around, and then kind of create the chain of anchors. And so far it's working beautifully. That's a new handbook by Ted Lowe, who was very supportive of that network. There's this German branch of the psychological anthropology. There is a blog, if you have students or you yourself or early career researchers, we have a blog that is run by students and for students in order to publish about psi realms, as we call it. There is also, I don't know whether you know this. This is a new journal, and I don't want to. I think it's a good new anchor. It publishes papers in German, English, and French for the time being, and it's about historical perspectives on psychology mostly. And we're creating, and maybe you would even be interested in doing this together, or maybe not. We can think about a title. The editors have invited anchors like ours, and also yours or ours, to submit proposals for a longer standing series. They're not calling it special issues any longer, they're calling it collections. And we're thinking about contributing, like advocating for open access, and also contributing a series called Critical Psychological Anthropology, but we're super open to the branding. We do not necessarily need the branding of psychological anthropology, but since this is where we met, we're going to continue that for the time being. And this is a beautiful podcast also edited by also early career researchers on, you can listen to it on Spotify, about the history and different anchors in psychological anthropology. Thank you so much for your patience. It took a bit longer than expected.